my name is Charles Harper. I'm 56, and for the past 30 years, I've built a life centered around loyalty, discipline, and integrity. These principles shaped my career as a military strategist and my personal life. Or so I thought. Last Thursday night, I came home early. It wasn't planned, and my meeting ended sooner than expected. As I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark, except for a faint glow coming from the upstairs window, a bedroom. Strange, I thought, since Lisa, my wife of 28 years, always left the downstairs lights on for me. Quietly, I stepped inside. I didn't call out. I just stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of the muffled sound of her voice coming from above. She was on the phone, laughing softly. A different kind of laugh, one I hadn't heard directed at me in years. I moved silently up the stairs, positioning myself just outside the bedroom door. I could hear her clearly now. "I know. It's risky, but you're worth it," she said, her tone laced with something dangerously intimate. I clenched my jaw and pulled out my phone. Without hesitation, I hit record. "You're the only one who makes me feel alive," she continued. Then, after a pause, "And no, don't worry about Charles. He's clueless." That was all I needed. I stepped away before she could notice, leaving the house as quietly as I'd entered. I sat in my car for a while, replaying the recording, not because I doubted what I'd heard but because I wanted to ensure every word was perfectly captured. This wasn't the time for emotions. Emotions cloud judgment. Instead, I started planning. The first step was gathering undeniable evidence. My wife, the woman I thought I knew, had just declared me irrelevant to someone else. She didn't know yet, but that declaration would cost her everything. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because I had too much to do. The betrayal I uncovered last night wasn't going to be met with silence or hesitation. I've spent my life solving problems, eliminating threats, and making decisive moves. This situation wouldn't be any different. I didn't confront Lisa. Not yet. Confrontation gives the enemy time to regroup, to lie, to manipulate. Instead, I left the house before she woke up. The first stop was a coffee shop downtown, where I contacted an old friend, Paul. Paul was a private investigator I'd worked with during my time consulting for the police force. He owed me a few favors, and I was about to collect. "Charles, it's been a while," Paul said when he answered my call. "I need surveillance, Paul. Discreet and thorough." "It's personal," I replied, my tone leaving no room for questions. "You got it. Send me the details." I sent Paul the recording I'd made the night before, along with Lisa's phone number and her typical schedule. My goal wasn't just to confirm her infidelity, it was to gather enough evidence to ensure she couldn't deny it, twist it, or weasel her way out when the time came. By 9 a.m., I was sitting in my lawyer's office. Walter Hayes had handled my business matters for years, and while this wasn't our usual line of work, I trusted him implicitly. "Charles, what brings you in today?" Walter asked, leaning back in his chair. "Divorce," I said flatly. "And I need it airtight." Walter nodded, pulling out a legal pad. "Tell me everything." I outlined what I knew, the late nights, the phone calls, the recording. I didn't sugarcoat anything. "I want to freeze all joint accounts," I continued. "I want her locked out of every financial asset we share." "Can you do that?" Walter's face hardened. "Yes, but you'll need proof to back it up if she contests it in court." "That's already in motion," I replied. "I'll have what you need by the end of the week." By the time I left Walter's office, I had a clear plan. Lisa had no idea that the walls were already closing in. When I got home that evening, Lisa was in the kitchen making dinner, as if nothing had happened. The sight of her standing there, acting like the devoted wife, was almost laughable. "You're home late," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Work," I replied curtly, moving past her to pour myself a drink. As I sipped my whiskey, I noticed her phone sitting on the counter, unlocked. She must have been texting when I walked in. For a brief second, I considered grabbing it, but I didn't need to. Paul's surveillance would give me everything I needed soon enough. The next few days passed in calculated silence. I acted like nothing was wrong, but behind the scenes, I was laying traps she wouldn't see coming. Paul sent me regular updates, photos of Lisa meeting her lover at a hotel, timestamps proving she'd lied about where she'd been. He even managed to intercept a few text messages. One of them read, "I can't wait to see you tonight. Charles has no clue." By Friday, I had a mountain of evidence. Photos, videos, text logs, enough to destroy her in court. But I wasn't going to stop at legal revenge. That night, I made sure to be home when Lisa left for one of her yoga classes. I followed her at a safe distance, watching as she drove to the same hotel Paul had been surveilling all week. She didn't even try to be discreet. I parked 2 blocks away and waited. 15 minutes later, she walked in with her lover, a man I now knew as Eric, a mid-level executive at some tech company. The thought of barging into their room crossed my mind, but that would be too easy. No, I wanted this to hurt. I wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal in every aspect of her life. Instead, I walked to the front desk and requested a room under a different name. From there, I called Paul. "They are in room 214, I said. "Can you get me the footage from the hallway cameras?" "Already done," Paul replied. "You'll have it by morning." I didn't sleep that night. I didn't need to. The adrenaline of knowing I was in control was more satisfying than any rest could be. The next morning, I confronted Lisa in the most calculated way possible. I printed the photos Paul had taken, the texts he intercepted, and a copy of our bank statement showing the hotel charges she thought I wouldn't notice. When she came downstairs, I was waiting for her at the dining table, the evidence spread out in front of me. "What's this?" she asked, her voice faltering as she took in the images. "This," I said coldly, "is the end of your game." By Saturday morning, the pieces were falling into place. Lisa, oblivious as ever, was still playing the role of a loving wife. She greeted me with a smile, offered me coffee, and chatted about plans for the weekend. It was almost comical watching her act as though her secrets weren't unraveling around her. What she didn't know was that I already had control of every financial account we shared. Walter had ensured that her access was cut off while leaving just enough in the visible balances to keep her from realizing it immediately. Meanwhile, Paul's surveillance had captured more than I'd hoped for, and not only photos of her and Eric entering the hotel, but audio from the hallway and even footage from a nearby parking lot showing them embracing. But the real jackpot came later that morning. Paul called with an update. "You're not going to believe this, Charles," he began, his voice almost amused. "Eric's not just her lover. He's using her." "What do you mean?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "He's been borrowing money from her," Paul said. "Big amounts. Bank transfers, cash withdrawals, he's draining her, man." The revelation was both infuriating and gratifying. Lisa's betrayal had already pushed me beyond forgiveness, but knowing she was being played as well added a dark layer of satisfaction. That evening, I decided to let her dig her own grave a little deeper. Lisa had a habit of leaving her laptop open on the kitchen counter while cooking. She wasn't tech-savvy, and I'd always handled the passwords and security for her devices. So when she left the room to answer a phone call, I took my chance. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. In her email, I discovered a thread between her and Eric discussing their future plans. He was feeding her fantasies of running away together, painting a picture of a new life far from the boring stability of our marriage. She, in turn, was promising to help him get on his feet, referencing the money she'd already given him. But the most damning piece was a document she downloaded just 3 days ago, a draft of a separation agreement she planned to spring on me. I transferred every incriminating file to a USB drive and deleted the evidence of my access. Sunday morning was the breaking point. Lisa told me she needed to run errands in the afternoon, but I already knew she was meeting Eric. This time, I wasn't going to sit idly by. I followed her to the hotel and parked discreetly across the street. From the car, I called Paul. "Are we ready?" I asked. "Everything's in position," he replied. I stepped out of the car and walked into the hotel lobby, pretending to check my phone as I made my way to the elevator. Paul had ensured I'd have access to the security cameras, so I knew exactly where they were, at room 314. I reached the hallway just in time to see Lisa opening the door for Eric. She greeted him with a kiss, her laughter echoing faintly as the door closed behind them. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at that closed door. Then I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and hit record. The confrontation came an hour later, but not in the way Lisa or Eric expected. I waited in the hotel lobby, seated near the front desk. Paul's team had already sent me the audio from their room, a conversation that included Eric pressuring Lisa for more money and even mocking her naivety. I had everything I needed. When they finally emerged, laughing and holding hands, I stood directly in their path. Lisa froze, her face draining of color. "Charles," she stammered, dropping Eric's hand as though that might somehow erase what I'd just seen. Eric, to his credit, didn't even try to bluff. He just stared at me, his expression caught between fear and defiance. "Enjoying your little fantasy?" I asked, my voice calm but cutting. Lisa opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Save it," I said. "I've heard enough." I handed her a manila envelope containing the evidence I'd collected, photos, audio transcripts, financial records. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her eyes scanning the contents in growing horror. "You thought I didn't know," I continued, stepping closer. "You thought you were smarter than me. You not. And now, you going to face the consequences." I turned to Eric. "And you. If I ever see your face again, it'll be the last time you walk anywhere without crutches. Do you understand me?" Eric paled but nodded, retreating a step as though distance might save him. Without another word, I walked out, leaving them standing there in stunned silence. Saturday morning arrived, and the house felt unnaturally quiet. Lisa moved about with forced normalcy, pretending nothing had happened. She avoided meeting my eyes, as if she could wish away the events of the past few days. I let her play her role because, unbeknownst to her, I wasn't finished yet. After the hotel confrontation, I shifted gears. The evidence I had was enough to end our marriage and win in court, but my plans went beyond legalities. Lisa and her lover wouldn't just lose, they'd be dismantled piece by piece. By 8 a.m., I was at Walter Hayes' office. Walter, my lawyer of many years, had already frozen our joint accounts, but now I wanted to go further. "I need to push for full control of the house," I told him as I sat across from his desk. Walter nodded, leaning forward. "That's doable, but she may contest it." "She won't," I said with certainty. "I've already taken away her financial safety net. She can't fight a battle without resources." Walter considered this for a moment before agreeing. "If you want this expedited, I'll need additional evidence to lock down the narrative." "I'll get you everything you need," I replied. That afternoon, Paul, my private investigator, called with a new development. "Charles, you going to want to see this," he began. "Eric's playing her." "Explain," I said, already suspecting what was coming. "He's been funneling money from her," Paul continued. "Cash withdrawals, wire transfers, it's all there. He's draining her dry." Hearing this was both infuriating and satisfying. Lisa's betrayal had already solidified my resolve, but knowing she was being exploited by the man she risked everything for added an ironic twist to the situation. "Send me the records," I instructed. "I'll email you everything," Paul said. By the time I got home that evening, Lisa was in the kitchen, trying to act as though nothing was wrong. The sight of her standing there, pretending to be the dutiful wife, was almost laughable. "You're home late," she said casually. "Work," I replied curtly, brushing past her. As I poured myself a drink, I noticed her phone on the counter. It was unlocked, the screen still glowing from a recent message. I didn't need to read it. Paul had already intercepted most of her communication. For the next few days, I kept the facade of normalcy. I didn't confront her or give her any reason to suspect what I was planning. Meanwhile, Paul continued to feed me information. He provided surveillance footage, intercepted text messages, and bank records that painted a damning picture of Lisa and Eric's relationship. By Friday, I had everything I needed. That night, Lisa told me she had a late yoga class. I followed her as she drove to the same hotel where she'd met Eric before. This time, I parked a few blocks away and waited. From my vantage point, I watched her enter the building. She didn't even bother looking around to see if she was being followed. Inside, she met Eric, and they walked arm in arm toward the elevator. I didn't follow them upstairs. Instead, I stayed in the lobby, waiting for them to come back down. Paul's team had already set up surveillance cameras in the hallways, capturing their every move. The next morning, I took the final steps. Lisa came downstairs to find me seated at the dining table. In front of me was a stack of papers, the divorce filing, copies of her financial records, and photographs of her with Eric. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Your future," I replied coldly. She picked up the papers and began to leaf through them. As the reality of what she was looking at sank in, her face paled. "Charles, I can explain." "No," I interrupted. "You don't get to explain. You don't get to lie, manipulate, or make excuses. You made your choices, Lisa, and now you'll face the consequences." She sat down, her hands shaking. "It was a mistake," she said weakly. "A mistake?" I shot back. "Sneaking around for months, lying to my face, and planning to take what I've built, that's not a mistake, Lisa. That's a calculated betrayal." Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "You have 1 week to leave this house," I continued. "All accounts are frozen. You'll get what the court allows, but nothing more. And don't think Eric will save you, he's been using you, Lisa. You're just another mark to him." She opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. "I've already sent him the same evidence you're holding," I said. "By now, he knows exactly what's coming for him." Later that day, Paul informed me that Eric's other girlfriend, Vanessa, had confronted him. The fallout was immediate. Vanessa caused a scene at Eric's office, which resulted in his boss questioning his professionalism. By evening, Lisa had tracked Eric down and confronted him in public, yelling about his betrayal. I wasn't there to see it, but Paul had recorded the audio. "You lied to me," Lisa screamed. "You said we had a future." "Lisa, calm down," Eric replied weakly. "Don't tell me to calm down," she shouted. Listening to the recording, I felt a grim satisfaction. Lisa and Eric had destroyed themselves, and I hadn't even lifted a finger. By the next week, Lisa was still in the house, clinging to a facade of normalcy despite knowing full well the rug had already been pulled out from under her. She tried to start conversations, make meals, and even forced a few tears to evoke pity. None of it worked. I'd made it clear that there was no way back for her, but in her desperation, she either refused to believe me or thought she could manipulate me into forgiving her. What Lisa didn't know was that the walls were closing in on her and Eric faster than she could imagine. That morning, I walked into Eric's workplace armed with everything Paul had dug up. His embezzlement was undeniable: misappropriated funds, falsified documents, and a trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to him. I wasn't just looking to ruin his career, I wanted to scorch the earth so nothing would grow back. Eric's boss, Claudia Reynolds, greeted me with a no-nonsense demeanor. As I placed the folder of evidence on her desk, she flipped through the contents with an increasingly dark expression. "This is extensive," she said finally, her voice sharp. "It's also verifiable," I replied. "I thought you'd want to handle this internally before it becomes a public scandal." Claudia's jaw tightened as she processed what she was reading. She glanced up at me, her eyes hard. "Why are you bringing this to me?" "Because people like Eric shouldn't be allowed to thrive at the expense of others," I said evenly. "And because I prefer to deal with problems head-on." She didn't respond immediately, but I could see her making calculations in her head. After a long pause, she nodded. "I'll take it from here." When I returned home that evening, Lisa was waiting for me. "Charles," she began hesitantly, "we need to talk." "No, we don't," I replied curtly. "Please," she insisted, her voice trembling. "I know I've made mistakes, but I can fix this." "We can fix this." I set my glass of bourbon down and turned to face her. "Fix this?" I repeated, my voice icy. "Lisa, you didn't make a mistake. You made choices. You betrayed me, and now you're only here because you have nowhere else to go. Eric doesn't want you. He never did." Her eyes filled with tears, her lips quivering as she tried to form a response. "That's not true," she whispered. "It is," I said firmly. "And soon, Eric won't even be able to help himself, let alone you." The next day, Paul sent me a video that was more satisfying than I could have hoped. It showed Eric being escorted out of his office by security, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. Claudia had acted quickly, terminating him on the spot and forwarding the evidence of his embezzlement to the authorities. I forwarded the video to Lisa without a single word. Within minutes, she called me, her voice frantic. "What did you do?" she demanded. "I exposed the truth," I replied calmly. "You had no right." "I had every right," I interrupted. "You made your choices, Lisa. Now you'll live with them." That evening, I hosted a dinner for a small group of mutual friends. Lisa, desperate to maintain some semblance of her old life, played along, dressing up and pretending to be the perfect wife. She smiled, poured drinks, and made polite conversation, but I could see the cracks in her facade. Once everyone had settled in the living room, I stood and cleared my throat. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "There's something I need to share with you tonight." Lisa's smile faltered as she looked at me, her face paling with each passing second. "For the past several months, Lisa has been having an affair," I said, holding up a folder. "With a man who not only lied to her but also exploited her for financial gain." Gasps filled the room as I handed the folder to one of our closest friends. The evidence, photos, bank records, and transcripts of messages, was indisputable. "Charles, please," Lisa whispered, her voice breaking. "No," I said firmly. "You don't get to plead or explain. Not after what you've done." I turned back to our friends. Lisa thought she could have it all, a husband who provided for her and a lover who entertained her. But actions have consequences. And tonight, she'll face them. Lisa fled the room in tears, leaving our friends stunned and murmuring amongst themselves. As I stood there, watching the fallout unfold, I felt no regret. This wasn't cruelty, it was justice. After the dinner party, Lisa retreated into a shell. She spent most of her time in the bedroom, avoiding me and our mutual friends who had left the house that night in stunned silence. Her phone calls to Eric had gone unanswered since his downfall, and she was beginning to understand that her safety net was gone. I wasn't done yet. Destroying her social circle and Eric's career was just the first act. I wanted Lisa to feel what it was like to be stripped of everything she thought she controlled, every illusion she used to comfort herself. The first step was to finalize the financial side of the divorce. Walter, my lawyer, had been methodically locking down our assets, ensuring that Lisa had no access to anything beyond what the court would require me to provide. She still hasn't contested anything? Walter asked during our latest meeting. She won't, I replied. She knows she doesn't have a leg to stand on. The evidence is airtight. Walter nodded, flipping through the divorce documents. Then we'll proceed with liquidating the unnecessary assets. The court will approve it within a week. Good, I said, leaning back in my chair. Sell her car first. She won't need it where she's going. Walter's eyebrow twitched at the coldness in my voice, but he didn't comment. That evening, I confronted Lisa directly. I'll need the keys to the Lexus, I said as she sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her untouched dinner. What? She asked, snapping out of her daze. The car, I repeated. You won't be needing it anymore. It's being sold tomorrow. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in days, she looked genuinely panicked. You can't do that, she said. It's my car. It was bought with my money, I replied coldly. And since you no longer contribute to this household, it's being sold along with everything else unnecessary. Lisa stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You're trying to leave me with nothing. I stared her down, unflinching. You left yourself with nothing the moment you betrayed me. Now hand over the keys. Her face crumpled as she dug through her purse, tossing the keys onto the table before storming out of the room. The next phase of my plan involved dismantling the last vestiges of Lisa's dignity. Paul had been monitoring her attempts to contact Eric, and while Eric had gone radio silent, Lisa was still trying to reach him through mutual acquaintances. One of those acquaintances, Vanessa, the woman Eric had been seeing behind Lisa's back, was more than willing to collaborate. I've been waiting for this, Vanessa said when I called her. He thought he could use me, too. What do you need? Nothing complicated, I replied. Just make sure Lisa knows exactly who Eric is and what is done. Vanessa's laugh was sharp and humorless. Consider it done. A few days later, Lisa's world began to crumble even further. Vanessa had forwarded Lisa every incriminating detail about Eric's lies, his manipulation, and his other affairs. She even attached a video of Eric berating Lisa in a private conversation Paul had recorded during one of their earlier meetings. You really thought I cared about you? Eric sneered in the video. You were just convenient. Do you know how pathetic you look begging me for attention? Paul sent me the video, too. I watched it only once, and for a brief moment, I almost felt pity for Lisa. Almost. When Lisa saw the video, her reaction was explosive. She threw her phone across the room, shattering it against the wall. I heard her sobbing upstairs, but I didn't go to her. Let her sit in the mess she created. By the end of the week, Lisa was a shell of her former self. Her social circle had abandoned her, Eric had humiliated her, and she was left with no financial security. It was time for the final blow. I waited until she came downstairs one morning, her hair unkempt and her face hollow. We need to talk, I said, my tone calm but firm. Lisa hesitated before sitting across from me at the dining table. I've given you time to process everything, I began. Now it's time for you to leave. Leave, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. You've been served with divorce papers. The accounts are closed, and the house is in my name. You have nothing left here, Lisa. It's over. She stared at me, her hands trembling on the table. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem, I replied. You made your bed. Now you can lie in it, somewhere else. Lisa's silence over the following days wasn't born out of peace, it was the quiet of someone who had lost every foothold in her life. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. She avoided me, skulking from room to room, but I could see her anger bubbling beneath the surface. That anger wasn't enough to save her. I had finalized everything. The house was mine, and the accounts were inaccessible to her. The Lexus, her prized possession, was sold that morning. Walter had already sent me confirmation of the transfer, ensuring Lisa wouldn't see another dime from our shared assets. By this point, even her closest friends had turned their backs on her. She was a pariah, both socially and financially. But I wasn't finished. That evening, I decided it was time to force the next step. "Lisa," I said as I stood in the doorway to the kitchen, watching her stir a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. She looked up, startled, but quickly masked it with indifference. "What is it?" "You need to pack your things," I said firmly. Her face twisted in confusion and panic. "What do you mean?" "You've overstayed your welcome," I replied coldly. "You'll leave by the end of the day." She stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't just throw me out like this." "I can," I said, my tone unyielding. "This is my house now. You're no longer entitled to anything here." Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't move me. "Where am I supposed to go?" "That's not my problem," I replied sharply. "You've had weeks to figure it out." Lisa stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door to the bedroom behind her. I didn't follow. She could cry, scream, or beg, but it wouldn't change the outcome. 2 hours later, Lisa emerged with 2 suitcases. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and her hands trembled as she dragged the luggage to the front door. "Is this what you wanted?" she spat, her voice cracking. "What I wanted was a faithful wife," I replied evenly. "This is what your choices earned you." I handed her an envelope as she stepped outside. "What's this?" she asked, frowning. "Your severance package," I said. Inside was a check for a modest sum, enough to cover basic necessities for a few weeks. I wasn't doing it out of kindness, I simply wanted her gone without an excuse to linger. "Goodbye, Lisa," I said, shutting the door firmly behind her. That evening, Paul called with an update on Eric. "He's spiraling," Paul said, amusement in his voice. "The IRS is onto him, and the fraud case is gaining traction. He's running out of allies fast." "Keep me updated," I replied. Vanessa, the woman Eric had been seeing alongside Lisa, had also played her part beautifully. She sent me a video of one of their arguments, where Eric, in his arrogance, admitted to using Lisa. She was pathetic, Eric sneered in the video. She thought she was special, but she was just convenient. Vanessa had ensured Lisa received the video as well. That final betrayal from the man she'd thrown everything away for was the nail in the coffin. The fallout was swift and merciless. Lisa had moved into a small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of town. She had no job, no friends, and no support. Her attempts to contact Eric had been met with silence, and Vanessa's video haunted her every waking moment. Meanwhile, Eric's world continued to crumble. His former employer had reported him to the authorities, and the IRS had frozen his accounts pending investigation. He was facing multiple charges, and it was only a matter of time before he was hauled into court. I watched it all unfold with a detached satisfaction. This wasn't about vengeance anymore, it was about balance. Both of them had played their games, thinking there would be no consequences. They'd learned otherwise. 1 week later, I received a final call from Paul. "Eric's been arrested," Paul said. "He won't be getting out anytime soon." I hung up the phone and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp evening air. The house was quiet now, devoid of the chaos and lies that had once filled its walls. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. Lisa and Eric were gone, their lives in ruins. And I had my life back, stronger, sharper, and untethered from their betrayal. Lisa's departure left a quiet in the house that was almost unsettling. The chaos she brought with her, her excuses, her lies, her desperation, had all dissipated. For the first time in years, the space was entirely mine, and yet, my work wasn't done. I didn't just want her and Eric to feel the sting of their mistakes, I wanted them to understand that their choices had long-term consequences. They needed to live in the shadows of their own ruin, knowing that this was a fate they had crafted for themselves. 2 days after Lisa left, Paul sent me another update. "You're not going to believe this," he said, amusement evident in his tone. "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward in my chair. "Eric's been trying to reach Lisa," Paul said. "He's desperate. Apparently, he thinks she might still have some money stashed away." I let out a humorless laugh. The irony was delicious. After using Lisa, mocking her, and tossing her aside, Eric was now groveling at her feet for help. "Did she respond?" I asked. "No," Paul replied. "Looks like she's ignoring him." "Smart move, but it's too little, too late," I said. "Keep monitoring him. I want to know everything he's doing." That evening, I took a walk through the house, stopping in what used to be Lisa's favorite room, her meticulously decorated sitting area. It was where she entertained friends, gossiped, and likely planned some of her lies. I'd left it untouched after her departure, but now, I stood there with a purpose. One by one, I removed every piece of furniture, every decoration, every reminder of her presence. By the time I was finished, the room was empty, stripped of all traces of her. It felt good. Meanwhile, Eric's downfall continued to escalate. The fraud charges against him had grown more serious as additional victims came forward. His name, once associated with success and charm, was now synonymous with deceit and scandal. Paul sent me an email detailing the latest developments, including Eric's failed attempts to secure legal representation. "He can't even afford a decent lawyer," Paul wrote. "He's burned every bridge he had." I forwarded the email to Vanessa, who was still more than willing to help dismantle Eric's reputation further. She'd already shared his video confession with his former colleagues, ensuring that no one in his industry would touch him with a 10-foot pole. "Let's turn up the heat," I told Paul during our next call. "Find out where he's staying. I want to know everything." A week later, I had my answer. Eric was holed up in a dingy motel on the outskirts of town, living off scraps of whatever money he had left. The image of him, once so smug and self-assured, reduced to this level of desperation was almost too satisfying. But I wasn't done. I contacted the motel's management anonymously and informed them about Eric's ongoing legal troubles, framing it as a warning for their own liability. Within hours, Eric was evicted, his belongings unceremoniously dumped on the sidewalk. Paul captured the moment on video, Eric, disheveled and furious, shouting at the motel staff as they walked away. I sent the video to Lisa with a single-line message, "This is the man you betrayed me for." She didn't respond, but I didn't need her to. The message was clear. As for Lisa, her isolation only deepened. She was still living in the cramped apartment I'd sent her to, barely scraping by on what little money she had left. I knew from Paul's updates that she'd tried to reconnect with some of her old friends, but none of them wanted anything to do with her. Her attempts to find work had been equally fruitless. Despite her polished appearance and carefully crafted resume, word of her affair and her fall from grace had spread far enough to poison any potential opportunities. She was trapped, her pride and reputation in tatters, and I made sure she knew it. The final act came in the form of a public reckoning. I compiled everything I had, Eric's fraudulent activities, Lisa's betrayal, and the tangled web of lies they'd spun, and sent it to a local journalist under an anonymous alias. The story was too scandalous to ignore, a man who embezzled from his company and ruined countless lives, entangled in a salacious affair with a woman who'd abandoned her longtime marriage for empty promises. Within days, the article was published. The headline alone was enough to draw attention, and the accompanying photos and evidence ensured it spread like wildfire. Eric's remaining connections severed ties immediately. Lisa, though unnamed in the article, was identified by those who knew her, cementing her fall from grace. That evening, I sat on the back porch with a glass of bourbon, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time, I felt a sense of closure. Lisa and Eric were gone, their lives reduced to the wreckage they had created. I had no intention of looking back. This chapter was closed, and I was ready to move forward, stronger, wiser, and free. Lisa's departure marked the beginning of the final act. With her safety nets gone, she was floundering. The walls of her carefully constructed lies were crumbling, and the world outside was no longer a forgiving place. But I wasn't done ensuring that every bridge she had burned remained in ashes. Paul called 2 days after she left. "She's been hopping between couches," he said. "A couple of her so-called friends let her stay for a night or two, but they're starting to realize she's toxic baggage. Most are ghosting her now." "What about Eric?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. Paul chuckled. "He's hitting rock bottom faster than her. He tried to rent an apartment under a fake name, but the landlord caught on and reported him. Now he's holed up in a motel, running out of cash." The image of Eric, the man who thought he could have it all, reduced to such desperation, brought a grim satisfaction. "Keep the pressure on," I said. I decided it was time to see Lisa one last time. Paul had tracked her to a dingy apartment complex in a rough part of town. When I arrived, she was sitting outside on the stoop, her shoulders slumped and her face hollow. She looked up as I approached, her expression shifting from shock to unease. "Charles," she said hesitantly. I stopped a few feet away, my hands in my pockets. "How's freedom treating you?" Her face twisted in anger, but it quickly melted into despair. "You took everything from me," she said, her voice trembling. "No," I replied coldly. "You took everything from yourself. I just made sure you couldn't hide from it." Her lips trembled as she tried to muster a response, but the weight of my words silenced her. "You wanted to live without consequences," I continued. "Now you get to see what that really looks like. Goodbye, Lisa." I turned and walked away without looking back. Eric's situation wasn't much better, but I wasn't finished with him yet. Paul had discovered that Eric's fraud case had expanded. More victims had come forward, and his attempts to secure legal representation were failing. His accounts were frozen, and his debts were piling up. But I wanted to deliver a final, public humiliation. I reached out to Daniel, one of Eric's most vocal victims. Daniel had lost his business because of Eric's embezzlement, and he had been using social media to call out Eric's crimes. When I contacted him, Daniel was wary. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. "Because justice needs to be served," I replied. "And because people like Eric shouldn't get away with what they've done." I handed over a file of evidence that Paul had compiled, emails, financial records, and proof of Eric's fraudulent activities. Daniel's gratitude was palpable. "This is what I needed to take him down," he said, his voice steady with determination. Within days, Daniel's campaign against Eric gained momentum. Social media exploded with stories of Eric's crimes, each one tarnishing his name further. His former colleagues and business partners distanced themselves, ensuring that he had no support left. Meanwhile, Lisa's isolation deepened. She had been evicted from her apartment after failing to pay rent, and her attempts to reconnect with old friends were met with cold silence. Paul sent me a transcript of one of her conversations with an old friend. "I just need a place to stay for a little while," Lisa had written. The reply was blunt. "You made your bed, Lisa. Now lie in it." She was running out of places to turn. The final blow came from an unexpected source, Vanessa, Eric's other lover. She sent me a video she had secretly recorded during one of their fights. In the video, Eric sneered at Lisa's desperation. "She thought she was special," Eric said, his tone dripping with contempt. "But she was just another pawn. Women like her are a dime a dozen, easy to manipulate, easy to discard." Vanessa ensured Lisa saw the video before sending it to me. Paul later confirmed that Lisa's reaction was explosive. She smashed her phone in a fit of rage and spent hours crying, her world now fully shattered. Eric's public downfall reached its climax when Daniel and the other victims filed a lawsuit against him. The fraud investigation led to his arrest, and his mugshot was plastered across local news outlets. Lisa, meanwhile, faded into obscurity. She had no money, no home, and no one left to turn to. Her pride was gone, replaced by a hollow existence defined by the consequences of her own choices. One evening, I stood on the back porch of my now quiet home, a glass of bourbon in hand. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and red. Lisa and Eric were gone, their lives reduced to rubble. I didn't feel triumphant. This was never about winning. It was about restoring balance, about ensuring that justice prevailed. For the first time in months, I felt peace. The chapter was finally closed. With Eric behind bars and Lisa barely surviving, I should have felt closure. By all accounts, my plan had been executed perfectly. But something gnawed at me, a sense that their suffering hadn't truly equaled the magnitude of their betrayal. What they had done wasn't just a mistake or a lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate act of malice, and I wasn't convinced they'd fully faced the weight of their choices. I decided it was time for the final act, something that would ensure they would never forget what they'd done or escape the shadows of their actions. Paul called with another update on Lisa. "She's staying with some distant cousin," he said. "Barely eating, barely speaking. She looks terrible." "Good," I replied. "Keep watching her. Let me know the moment she tries to pull herself out of this." Paul's chuckle on the other end of the line told me we were on the same page. "And Eric?" I asked. "Prison life hasn't been kind to him," Paul said. "Apparently, he's already made enemies. One guy roughed him up in the yard last week." Hearing that brought a grim satisfaction. But I wanted to ensure that even from his cell, Eric's world remained in chaos. The first step was ensuring that Eric's remaining reputation, the faint whispers of sympathy from people who hadn't been burned by him, was completely obliterated. I reached out to Vanessa again. She had been more than willing to help expose Eric's true nature before, and I knew she wasn't finished. "I've got something bigger in mind," I told her over the phone. "Are you up for it?" Vanessa's laugh was sharp and eager. "What do you need me to do?" Together, Vanessa and I crafted a story, an exposé that detailed Eric's lies, manipulations, and fraud in excruciating detail. Vanessa provided personal anecdotes, text messages, and even recordings of Eric bragging about his scams. I submitted the story to a major news outlet anonymously, framing it as a warning to others who might cross paths with someone like Eric. When the article was published, it went viral almost immediately. The headline alone was damning. "The Sociopath Next Door: The Rise and Fall of Eric Matthews." The piece was merciless. It painted Eric not just as a criminal, but as a heartless manipulator who had destroyed lives for his own gain. Even from prison, the ripple effects reached him. Paul confirmed that other inmates had started to target him, seeing him as weak and despised. Lisa's downfall required a different approach. She wasn't a physical prisoner like Eric, but her isolation was just as profound. I had Paul leak the video of Eric mocking Lisa to one of her last remaining friends. The friend, perhaps out of spite or just sheer pettiness, shared it on social media with a scathing caption. "Imagine giving up everything for a man who says this about you." The post spread quickly, and soon Lisa's name was trending in the worst way possible. The comments were brutal, filled with ridicule and judgment. Paul sent me screenshots of some of the messages. "She's a joke. She deserved everything she got. Karma came for her hard." The humiliation was public and unrelenting. Lisa, who had once thrived on the admiration of others, was now a pariah. I wasn't content to stop there. I wanted to make sure Lisa never regained the foothold she'd once had. I reached out to a few of the employers she'd tried to contact, ensuring they knew exactly who they were considering hiring. "She has a history of deceit," I said in carefully worded emails. and a personal reputation that will reflect poorly on your organization. One by one, the opportunities dried up. Paul confirmed that her last few attempts to secure a job had failed, leaving her completely destitute. The final act came unexpectedly. Lisa reached out to me. Her message was short and desperate. "Please, I have nowhere else to go. I made a mistake. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "There's nothing left to say. Goodbye, Lisa." I blocked her number immediately after. Eric's fate was sealed when his trial concluded. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. The judge's closing remarks were brutal, describing him as a predator who preyed on the trust of others. Lisa, meanwhile, disappeared from public view. Word was that she'd moved to a distant city, trying to rebuild her life in obscurity. But I knew she'd carry the scars of her choices forever. One evening, as I sat on the back porch of my now peaceful home, I reflected on everything that had happened. The destruction of Lisa and Eric's lives wasn't just about vengeance, it was about ensuring that justice prevailed. I raised my glass to the setting sun, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. The chapter was closed, and this time, there was no doubt in my mind, I was free.